Welcome to Monthly Metz with Keith Metz.
Welcome to the Monthly Metz with Keith Metz, founder of the Metz Law Firm in North Carolina. Keith focuses on DWI, traffic violations, and misdemeanor criminal defense, helping people navigate charges that can affect their license, their record, and their future. I'm Shamika Rhymes, and today we're talking about speeding tickets in North Carolina and when a single ticket can put your license at risk. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you, Shamika.
Keith, how fast does someone have to be going before a speeding ticket can seriously threaten their license in North Carolina?
Not very fast at all. And there are several factors that kind of go into play here. And um, I always jest that North Carolina DMV does not want you driving in this state because there's a litany of different ways that your license can become suspended. But to directly answer your question, essentially anything that is 15 miles per hour or greater over the limit will suspend your driver's license. If you are convicted of an even 15 over, that's going to suspend your driver's license. This also gets a little bit more finicky once we get into speed ranges above 79 miles per hour. So for instance, if you are convicted of doing 80 in a 70, your license will be suspended. Um, the highest speed limit that we have on any highway in the state of North Carolina is 70 miles per hour, nothing greater than 70. So our state legislator has really cracked down on high speeds. They consider any speed of 80 miles an hour or greater excessive. And so a conviction of 80 and a 70 will suspend your driver's license.
That is good to know because I feel like on 485, people go well above 80.
Very fast.
So is that why they've now installed, and I don't know if you've noticed, they've now installed these, I guess they're speed traps along 485 because people are going, thinking they're at the speedway going 100.
So 485 has been an issue for law enforcement for years now. I want to say it was around COVID. So 2020, 2021-ish, a state trooper was killed from a high moving. He was pulled over investigating a car wreck, and somebody flew by at a very high rate of speed and hit the trooper, ran him over, and killed him. As a result of that, law enforcement locally, so the sheriff's office, CMPD, and state highway patrol will often do a lot of different things 485 in an attempt to slow people down, especially because the speed is pretty consistent there at 70 miles an hour. So as far as I'm aware, every section of 485 has a 70 mile an hour zone unless you're on an exit or entrance ramp. And as a result of that, people tend to fly. So it's the one area in Charlotte that I think probably you see the most policing on as a result.
Well, Keith, are there certain speeding charges that can lead to a suspension even if it's someone's first major ticket?
Yes, and this is sort of what I was discussing before. I hear this all the time from clients, but it's my first ticket. Why are the ramifications so bad? And the answer is that's just the law. And if you don't like it, you really need to write your legislator and get them to change the law, get the governor to sign off on it. It doesn't matter if you're a first-time offender. It doesn't matter if you have been driving since the invention of the automobile and you've never had a traffic ticket. The DA's offices don't negotiate on a lot of different things, and there are some things that you're just unfortunately going to get a suspended license for. So the common thing is going to be speeds of 100 miles an hour or greater. No DA's office that I'm aware in none of the counties. So I practice in Mecklenburg, Cabarrus, Gaston, and Union. No DA's offices negotiate reductions of speeds on the speed of 100 miles an hour or greater. So if you're doing 100 and a 70, for instance, on 485, the negotiation for that is going to be the reckless driving that will absolutely be attached to it will be dismissed, and you'll be pleading guilty to the speed. That will create a suspension of your driver's license for 1 year. So there are some things that unfortunately, it doesn't matter how clean your driving record is, can't touch. Speeds of 99 and below, depending upon what county we're in, are sometimes negotiable.
Because going back to what I was saying about the racing on, I mostly have heard it and seen it on 485, but I think it's happened on 77. I'm sure on 85 as well. Um, in those instances, when they are racing at night, or sometimes it's during the day, but mostly at night when they think the interstate is mostly clear, um, Is it safe to assume that that could also lead to a suspension if they're caught?
Yes, absolutely. And especially if we're dealing with racing, and especially in Mecklenburg County, this is lesser of a deal in Gaston, Cabarrus, and Union, but it has become a big thing in Mecklenburg County where we have street takeovers, and law enforcement's seriously cracking down on this. And it has become a problem in Mecklenburg County, both in general for actual street takeovers, but also for just charges being ran up on this. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of different things. So the statute for street takeover, first of all, if you're convicted of that, your license will be suspended. There is no limited driving privilege for you on a street takeover conviction. But the statute is very, very broad. It includes even posting about a street takeover. So if you're on Instagram or TikTok or X or Facebook and you share a post or post about it, that is unfortunately within the statute. Most of the attorneys that I know believe it is a violation of free speech to charge you with something like that. But even just sharing it can wind you up in trouble with the law. Now, if it's simply a share and nothing further, that's where hire a defense attorney such as myself to step in. But these street takeovers are becoming a major issue, and the DA's offices are really cracking down on them as well. As I indicated, certainly will lead to a suspended driver's license.
Might have to do a whole episode on the street racing because that's a whole that's a whole conversation right there. What is the difference between DMV points versus insurance points, and how do both end up affecting drivers?
So this is a great question because North Carolina, I think, is very different from other states. I grew up in Florida where they were one and the same. I think most people who are not within North Carolina, who maybe moved here from out of state, are unfamiliar with this, as I was until I moved here. Um, So we have what's called a two-tiered point system. We have DMV points and we have insurance points. DMV points are also known as license points. Now, the DMV uses their point system just to determine your driving privileges. So, for instance, if you exceed 12 DMV points within a 1 year time span, your license will be suspended. So, what DMV is using their point system for is to determine your status as a valid licensed driver within the state of North Carolina. That's it. They're not using it for points at all. The insurance points are used by insurance companies to assess what your premiums are going to be. And the point scale systems between DMV points and insurance points are similar, but also different in some areas. There are some areas where the insurance points are lower than DMV points. The points determine what your premiums are going to look like. So the more points you get, obviously, the higher your premiums are going to be. But there are, for instance, some traffic reductions that we can get for you that might lead to 2 to 3 DMV points, but might not lead to any points on insurance. And so when we are dealing with clients and we are assessing what's the best possible reduction or outcome for our client's case, these are things that we're looking at. Is we want to make sure we don't cross a threshold for DMV points because we certainly don't want to get your driver's license suspended. But oftentimes that's not the case. In fact, usually that's not the case. Usually we are more so concerned, and so are our clients more so concerned with their insurance premiums going up. And so we always have to explain that, yeah, you're going to take a hit on DMV points, but that's okay because you have a ways to go before you have to worry about the consequences of that. What we're trying to do right now is save you from insurance points, and that's typically the goal, what most of our clients are looking for.
Well, let's say an out of state driver is coming through North Carolina. Can their driver's license be affected by a North Carolina speeding ticket?
This is a complicated question to answer, and that is because I'm not licensed to practice law in any state other than North Carolina. What I can say is that North Carolina driving privileges are at stake. So, for instance, let's take South Carolina, for instance, as we, especially in the Charlotte area, get a lot of South Carolina drivers coming through. Let's say you're from South Carolina, you're driving through Charlotte, so Mecklenburg County, and you are stopped for doing 100 in a 70 on 485. Um, as I indicated earlier, the DA's office will not reduce that. We would have to plead you guilty to the speed on that. The accompanying charge of reckless driving would definitely be dismissed. North Carolina cannot take your South Carolina driver's license. They don't have the authority to do that. What South Carolina is going to do to you is going to be left entirely up to South Carolina. So there might be ramifications with, in this example, South Carolina DMV, or in any other example, your home state's DMV. That's going to be left up for that DMV to interpret your own home state's law. What North Carolina will do is they will suspend your North Carolina driving privileges. So again, they don't have the authority to take your South Carolina driver's license, but what they can say is, look, we don't care what South Carolina does to you. Maybe South Carolina doesn't suspend you at all, but it means you cannot legally drive on the roads in North Carolina for a year. At the end of that year, you also have to remember to follow up with the North Carolina DMV. You pay them a reinstatement fee to reinstate your driving privileges in the state of North Carolina. Again, this is regardless of what South Carolina or any other state might do to you. We often get this problem with people who are like from the other side of the country, for instance, Colorado, the West Coast, and they're driving through. And I always have to remind them, like, even if your home state doesn't suspend you, North Carolina will. And it might not impact you because you may never find yourself driving through North Carolina ever again. But if you don't a year later pay that reinstatement fee, what'll happen is 10 years from now, you'll randomly be driving through the state of North Carolina and get pulled over for running a stop sign or something. And then the officer is going to see your driver's license is still suspended in North Carolina, and they're going to charge you for it appropriately with a driving while license revoke charge.
And I think about all the people that work in, say, Fort Mill, that, that part of South Carolina, and they drive into Charlotte for work. I mean, that could impact them because they're not going to be able to drive in for work.
Absolutely. We see that all the time, and it's unfortunate, but it's something for drivers that have to drive in North Carolina need to be aware of.
Well, what kinds of speeding cases create the biggest problems for drivers long term? This sounds like what we just talked about would be one for those that are in South Carolina.
Yeah, and it's it's also going to vary from county to county because different DA's offices treat things differently. For instance, both Cabarrus and Gaston County does not negotiate on speeding charges with a speed as 90 miles an hour or greater. So their negotiation is going to be you can pick one and they'll dismiss the other. In other words, you can either pick pleading guilty to the speed and they'll agree to dismiss the reckless driving charge, or you can plead guilty to the reckless driving charge and the DA's office will dismiss the speed. This is not necessarily true in Union or Mecklenburg County. So sometimes it just varies from county to county. It also varies depending upon where your license is out of, which state it's out of. Also, it's going to vary depending upon what your driving record currently looks like. I mentioned earlier, for instance, that 12 points is the cutoff. If you're at 9 points and we're about to plead you guilty to something that's worth 3 points, your license is about to be suspended. Um, the suspension period is never going to be greater than 1 year for these types of matters. So the worst, sort of length of time that we're looking at is a year. 6 months, it's typically marked into three different categories. There's suspension of 30 days, suspension of 6 months, and suspension of 12 months. The only way we can see longer than that is if during your period of suspension, let's say you're suspended for 12 months, if during that time you pick up another moving violation and you're found guilty of that moving violation, say another speeding ticket, then it adds an additional year. So if you are charged with moving violations while your license is suspended and you are convicted of them, DMV resuspends your license for an additional year. So sometimes we wind up with clients that are sort of in a vicious cycle of they keep picking up new citations while their license is suspended, and we keep just sort of kicking the can down the road. And that can be problematic. But generally speaking, when we're talking speeding tickets, the longest period of time that we're talking about is a 1 year suspension.
Well, when you're evaluating a speeding case, what parts of the stop or the citation do you look at the closest?
Stop usually rarely, unless the client indicates that the stop was funny. But usually speaking, if the officer alleges speeding, speeding is going to be the most common. If the officer is alleging speeding, then uh, it becomes very subjective. And I often get clients that insist, "Hey, I wasn't doing this speed, or maybe I was speeding, but I wasn't traveling that fast." And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that officers are trained to be able to estimate your speed based on nothing by looking at other than looking at your vehicle as you drive by. So we often get the, hey, the radar was off, the lidar was off. It doesn't matter. Even if we could somehow take it to a trial and prove that the radar was broken or not calibrated correctly, or the same with the lidar, you still have the officer's own word, and he or she is going to testify under oath that they've been trained to estimate speed based on nothing by looking at the object as moving by them. And he or she's going to testify that based on their training, they estimated your speed as X. And so long as they are within a few miles of what they actually claim they clocked you at, then that testimony is going to be taken as true and the court's going to find you guilty. So it's important to be aware of this because it's usually better. I say usually, I would say almost 100% of the time, better to simply try to negotiate something with the DA rather than taking the case to a trial. If we try the case, you're going to pay me or any other lawyer a lot more money to take it to a trial, and you're probably not going to like the outcome as much. So always recommend, negotiating for some plea offer if it's available. If it's not available, then it's about mitigating damages as much as possible, having secondary charges dismissed for a plea deal with the DA. Um, I hope that answers that question.
And we got a couple more minutes, so I wanted to make sure I get this question in. As we wrap up, why can simply paying a speeding ticket online sometimes create much bigger consequences than people expect?
Yeah, this is a great question. North Carolina has a cutoff where there are some citations you simply cannot pay online. So you can't necessarily pay everything online, but there are certainly matters where you can pay online. And the problem with this is by paying it online, you are effectively saying, I am guilty of whatever speed that you were charged with. I believe if I recall, just a couple of weeks ago, I had one where the client paid off an 80 and a 65. Well, as we know, 80 miles an hour is terms for an automatic suspension. So they were permitted to pay that off online, and they did. And as a result, they pled guilty. Pleading guilty to that meant DMV was coming for their license. So what we had to do is reopen the case and then it's called filing a motion for appropriate relief, which effectively reopens the case to negotiate a reduction with the DA. So there are matters and means by which we have that we can fix the problem. They're not foolproof. There are other factors that go into play here. The district attorney has to agree to it. The judge has to agree to it. So it's not a end all to be all that we can always reopen the case. And you're also going to pay a lawyer a lot more money to have to reopen the case than to simply have them negotiate the plea down. But absolutely, you can have ramifications. That's license ramifications. Of course, pleading guilty also means you're going to see your insurance premiums increase as well. So we never advise simply paying off the ticket. There are certain circumstances where I will advise a client, go ahead and do it. Those circumstances are, and that's only after I've reviewed the case. I don't, without speaking to an attorney, I would never advise simply paying off the ticket. There are certain circumstances where after I've reviewed the case, I've determined it's not worth the reduction. So what happens sometimes is officers will clock you out of speed. Let's use 80 and a 65 again as an example, and they'll tell you, hey, we stopped you for speeding, clocked you for doing 80 and a 65. I've looked at your driving record. It looks pretty clean. You've been polite and cooperative with me. I'm going to do you a favor and I'm going to reduce that 80 and a 65, that 15 over, down to a 9 over for you. So you're going to be looking at, what is that, 64 and a 55 instead of what he actually clocked you at. And then so your citation's actually going to read that 9 over, not the original 80. And then you're going to come to me and you're say, hey, can you do anything for me? And I'm going to look at your driving record and I might determine that no, unfortunately, there's nothing better that I can do for you. I would not, for instance, advise using a prayer for judgment continued on this. And maybe your driving record's not clean. Maybe I can't get an improper equipment for you. And so maybe the best thing that I can do for you is what you've already gotten. In those instances, I might say, here's a refund. Go ahead and take that money and pay it off online. But I would never recommend doing that without first having an attorney look at the case to make sure that's advisable.
Thank you so much, Keith. This has been so informative. Thank you for breaking down what happens if you get a speeding ticket and how it could affect your license.
Thank you for the amazing questions.
Well, that is it for today's episode of the Monthly Metz. If you'd like to learn more about Keith Metz and his work at the Metz Law Firm, visit keithmetzlaw.com. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like, leave a review, and subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next episode.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.